Hello and welcome back again. Recently I've sort of noticed that the content I've been putting out is all pretty heavy stuff, and all the videos are pretty long, and they're all pretty inaccessible too, especially the last one where I think I recorded it in one take, and so it sounds like I've got some kind of throat disease near the end of it. So I thought we'd just do something a bit more calm this time around, and I'm just going to ramble about books that I like for a bit. So if you've watched a few of these, you probably already know who I like Kazantzakis and Borges and Umberto Eco. But when I was younger, I was a particularly big fan of Mervyn Peake, who wrote the Gormenghast trilogy, among other things, and was actually primarily an artist, not an author, and yet he was somehow still one of the better prose stylists of the last century. And Gormenghast is this huge fantasy trilogy that came out, I think, was it just before or just after Lord of the Rings? I don't remember, quite when, but about the same time, and it was totally overshadowed because it was this very, very old-fashioned style of fantasy that, you know, it was very unique as well, and it wasn't really easy to copy in the way that Lord of the Rings was. And Gormenghast is this kind of fantasy of manners, where everything that happens is framed within this sort of social drama about a young man rising from the lowest strata of society right to the top and then falling back down again. So it's this sort of tragic model where the kitchen boy named Steerpike goes from being a lowly servant in the sort of the bowels of this insane castle all the way up to he maneuvers his way up to being what they call the master of ritual, who's sort of like the head priest. And then, well, events transpire and he loses that position. That's all I'll say on that matter. But it's got this sort of incredible iron-wrought prose on every single page. It's just constant. This thing never really lets up. And a lot of it is really funny. And it's funny not necessarily because it's telling you jokes, but because it looks like it's taking itself seriously. So it's talking about these very ridiculous things that are happening. And it does it in the most formal way, as though it doesn't even notice that what it's talking about is just ridiculous. I'm not going to be able to find it in here because this is like 1,000 pages long, right? But there's this one moment when Steerpike is setting up he's setting up some stuff for like a certain ritual or a certain funeral or some such thing. And there's a phrase in there that's like, he made sure that the horse head masks were inclined at the exactly correct angle of remonstrance or some ridiculous thing that, and it's peppered with that sort of thing. Really distinctive characters, very, very uniquely Mervyn Peake. And there are three of them, of course. It's a trilogy. The final one, Titus Alone, it's separated into Titus Groan, Gormenghast, and Titus Alone. Titus Alone was written when the author Mervyn Peake was suffering from I forget exactly what he had, but it was some horrible, mental degradation of some sort. So it's much shorter. It's much more abstract because he didn't have enough time to go over it and make it really sort of iron wrought and strictly logical like the others, so it's much more confused. But I find it fits the tone of that book quite well, because what actually happens in Titus Alone is much more abstract and confusing than what happened in either of the other two books. So a lot of people will tell you, oh, you can read Titus Alone and Gormenghast and then don't bother with Alone. Or did I say you can read Titus Alone and Gormenghast? I meant you can read Titus Groan and Gormenghast, but Titus Alone isn't as good. I think it is as good. It's just very, very different. So we'll put that away. I might do a reading from that eventually. I don't know. Maybe if I got a better microphone, I might bother. But that's okay. What else? Well, this year I started reading a Turkish guy named Orhan Pamuk, who is a lot like Umberto Eco, but he's more... What's the word? He's more emotional. Because Umberto Eco is, he does all that intertextual postmodern sort of stuff. And a lot of it is kind of heartless. because Umberto Eco is focused way more on the problem than he is on any of the characters. The characters are there to do things. They're not really there to feel anything. With Orhan Pamuk, he's trying to paint a picture of late 20th century Turkey. And so he does do all sorts of intertextual things, and, he writes sort of mysteries with answers that are hidden in the text and all this sort of thing. Especially the Black Book, where somebody effectively replaces somebody else in Turkish society by taking over their column and sort of accidentally taking over their life. But he has a lot more sympathy. And you can especially see that in some of his books like The Museum of Innocence. And even in the Black Book, even though the Black Book is much more cerebral than any of the other ones that I've read, it still has this sort of very Orhan Pamukish core of incredible sympathy. As for which one is the closest to Umberto Eco, if you want to find a good place to start, I haven't read everything by Orhan Pamuk yet, so I'm not really qualified to make a judgment, but I would say that My Name is Red is a good place to start with him. What else is in here? This is something that not a lot of people might bother with, actually, but there's a book written by the Assyriologist Irving Finkel. His lectures are on YouTube somewhere. They're highly worth a watch. He's a very funny guy. He's a very interesting guy. He looks a lot like how you would imagine some old Sumerian priest might look, despite the fact that he's extremely English, and it's just really fun to watch this guy. And he mostly writes non-fiction, so a good non-fiction book by him would be what was it called? Just Google Irving Finkel Ark, because Irving Finkel did this whole thing on reconstructing Noah's Ark as it would have looked, at the correct time, and it's this fascinating project. He wrote The Ark Before Noah, that was it. And it's all about the story of the flood as recorded in pre-biblical myths, right? So it's all the Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian stuff that was later repurposed by the Jews and stuck in the Bible as the Noah story. And actually, everyone goes on Irving Finkel for all the Ark stuff, but I just as much enjoy his discussions on cuneiform. In particular, a very short fiction book that he did called The Writing in the Stone, which is a kind of pre-modern murder mystery about what would happen if the wrong person got access to the wrong piece of clay at the wrong time. So it's about a Sumerian serial killer, and he's no sort of great prose stylist. If you read it, you can see a few odd choices here and there. But I thought it was highly entertaining. What else have I read recently? I've read Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone, and that was pretty good. But I don't have much to say about it. It's just sort of there. It's like, here I am. I'm a good book. All right, fantastic. What else is there to talk about? When I was a kid, and this is going to sound totally different to everything else you'll ever hear me talk about on this channel. It's a unique case. But when I was a kid, I was obsessed with The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, which is a pretty average Japanese light novel. And light novels are interesting, right? Because, I've only ever read them in English, but the translations are nearly always these terrible amateur ones done on the internet by weeaboos for other weeaboos. But they have almost universally been really horrible in my experience, because with the light novel, the whole point of it is that the author just gets all of the ideas out onto the page, sometimes, in as lax a fashion as he possibly can, and then just goes away and finishes there. It's just like, all right, and then this happened, and then this happened. I felt a horrible chilling of my gut, and then this happened, So it's really poor, but Haruhi Suzumiya was produced a bit before that became the popular style. And I was really a fan of it when I was much younger, just because it talked about all sorts of things that I liked. It talked about philosophy and science fiction, things like time travel, and it's a very sappy story as well, which I feel no guilt about whatsoever, and neither should you. I'm sick and tired of postmodern sardonicism, where a sincere emotion is seen as a weakness and something stupid and something cringy. That attitude needs to be eradicated as soon as possible. We just need to get back to being able to talk about what we actually feel. And that's why, now that I look at it, everything on the shelf is pretty sincere. A couple of months back, I decided to really give myself an education. So I sat down and read all of the tragic plays from ancient Greece. And I have to say, best playwright? Even though he kept winning like second and third places, and he actually, I'm not sure if he ever won first place, I would say Euripides was the best. Aeschylus is, high-headed and classical, but he doesn't, I mean, that's too early for literature to have actually developed any sense of the internal. So everything in Aeschylus is very outward. It's almost Homeric in that nobody ever seems to think anything. They just say what they feel, and then they talk about what they do. Not to mention that most of his plays are missing. So the best one we have is the Oresteia. Out of all, well, let's see, Aeschylus, right? The best plays are the Oresteia, which is about Orestes, Agamemnon returning from Troy, and Prometheus Bound. And Prometheus Bound isn't even reliably attested to Aeschylus anyway. From Sophocles, I mean, we already know what the best of Sophocles is, don't we? It's obviously Oedipus Rex. It's Oedipus. It's Oedipus. Of course it's Oedipus. And Euripides. Well, so much more of his stuff survives, right? So that there's so much more to pick from, but out of all of it, I'd have to say I really enjoyed the Bacchae and Ion. I don't know why Ion. There's something so comfy about Ion that makes it just more memorable to me. And of course it's got Apollo, which is never a miss, really, is it? What else should I talk about? There's a fair bit in this room. There's some Australian literature in here that I've never bothered with, even though I really should, because having not read it makes me kind of a hypocrite. But I guess I'll list off some names of some Australian stuff so that there is some record of us not having a totally dead, literary output, although I guess it is dead now. It was dying before, and now it is dead, because we never had the chance. This is a modern nation, and we never had the chance to develop a strictly unique identity after 1901, our federation, before the world wars started, and the American troops stayed here for a while and just gave us all of their culture. So we basically got Americanized before we could do anything really that Australian in the new century. That's why I think a lot of people in this country feel just so totally deracinated, and why they're so willing to just follow stuff from other places. I mean, that's why partly I'm here talking about all this stuff. Do you think I would have such a strong connection to novels that didn't come from this place if there were any from here, from the past 100 years, that were worth the time? That said, there are a couple. And a couple of years back, there was this imprint. Let me have a look at one of them, actually. Hold on. There's an imprint called Text Classics. And the publisher is... Oh, where are you? Yeah, Text Publishing, Melbourne, Australia. And they've been doing reprints of all of these old Australian classics from the past 200 years. So I've looked at a couple of them, but I haven't really dived into them yet. I've got this huge pile from a second-hand book sale that I like. And one day I was there and I thought, well, there's a massive pile of Australian stuff, so I might as well grab it while I can, right? And so I did, but it's all just sort of sat there. What else is worth your time? Well, let's see. And at some point I'm going to have to talk about the French historians, right? Because in the past 100 years, a bunch of Frenchies got together and they decided they were going to approach history in a totally different way. They were going to look at things, through the prism of mentalities, or how people thought at the time, and they were going to look at things from an economic perspective. And these guys started a journal called the Annales, which kind of ran for the next couple of decades. All throughout the 20th century, the Frenchies were this huge cultural movement of historians looking at history in probably the most interesting way that I've seen anyone do it. So I'm going to do a full thing on them eventually, once I read a few more of them. And I'll toss out a couple names then, but look for that. What else is going on? I have a website now. It's versofolio.xyz, and there's some fun stuff on there. Chiefly, it's sort of the scripts of what I've been saying half of this time, so that you don't have to listen to my awful voice to get the points. If you want to brush up on anything I've said. And I guess there'll be more stuff on there. There's some poetry, but it's not very good. Why not, right? Why don't we talk about the best Greek myths? The best Greek myth book is not actually Edith Hamilton's Mythology, which is what pseudo-intellectuals on the internet will tell you. The best Greek myth books, I'm just getting them out now, are the 8-part series of Greek mythology done by the Stefanidis brothers, whose first names are... Hang on, I'm having trouble getting it out of the pack. Yes, Greek mythology, retold by Menelaos Stefanidis, drawings by Yannis Stefanidis. And this is 8 volumes of basically all of the myths that anyone would ever care to tell you about. Not all of them, right? There's no Orphic stuff in here. And for some reason, there's no Odysseia. So if you want to get the full picture, you need Aeschylus as well as these. But if you get these 8 parts, and they're really good, they're really, really good. First, they were written just for kids, right? And then they became so popular that, like, what's his name? Menelaos rewrote them for a general audience. And they are just the best retellings of Greek mythology that I have ever seen. Second, I mean, if you have these 8 books, right? If you have these 8 books, the Odysseia, and then Calasso's Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, that's pretty much all you need. You don't need Stephen friggin' Fry, and you don't need Edith Hamilton either, although I suppose I will, get back into her at some point. But yeah, oh, man. There are a few people who annoy me more than Stephen Fry. And I suppose I won't get it too much into that, but he's just so smug. And I opened his retelling of the heroes, and who was it? Not Odysseus. Oedipus said some ridiculous quip. He was quipping to the Sphinx like a Marvel superhero, and I face-palmed and I thought, God, this could hardly get any worse. That's the Stephen Fry thing. He takes whatever he's looking at it. Wow, nice English. Sorry. He takes whatever he's looking at and he makes it into just an extension of himself, which is either the mark of a very good writer or a very annoying, cloying personality. And, I get the feeling that most good writers were like that. They must have been, they must have been these sort of cloying personalities, because you can see in the most distinctive books that it's their take on things that's supposed to shine through, right? And maybe not all of them were like that. Maybe only a minority of them were like that. In fact, only a minority of them were like that, because we know that most of these classical authors must have been very reserved sort of people. That would have been what had given them the time to observe whatever they observed. But at the very least, it's that oppressive, cloying, selfish quality that has to come through in all of the best writing, because that's what makes it distinct. That's the fetish part of it, if we could make a callback to that old video. What's another good one? A couple of years back, I read a pretty good book that was about journalism, and it was called The Continuous Catherine Mortenhoe by D.G. Compton, which on the first page had a very characteristic and a very interesting sentence. Or was it a clause? It doesn't matter. And it was, people are only true when they're continuous. And I've only read the book once, but I thought that was so distinctive that I remembered it all these years later, because of course it's exactly true, and that's a universal truth. Years and years back, my uncle got me the collected short stories of Philip K. Dick. The first one in the collection, and the one that I think I remember the best, is Roog, which is about 6 pages long, and it's about a dog barking at some garbage men, but it's really about something much worse. Philip K. Dick is probably the easiest place to start if you want to get an understanding of sort of metaphor in the sort of general sense and not just in the linguistic sense, because his whole shtick is that there's a world behind the world in which we live, and everything that's put up in front of us is just an illusion that covers up something far greater. So it's very in the vein of like G.K. Chesterton and Gene Wolfe almost, although I don't know if you would make those comparisons. I've been meaning to get into Chesterton, but I can't find anything by him for cheap. At least not as cheap as I would like. Book prices in here, as I'm sure you suspect, are absolutely through the roof, especially nowadays. There are some good Japanese crime novels written by a guy whose pen name is Keigo Higashino, and they are Salvation of a Saint and The Devotion of Suspect X. They're very light reads. You can get through them in a couple of hours, but they're really interesting. Just some, I thought I'd toss that in there because they're not bad modern Japanese crime. J.M. Coetzee. J.M. Coetzee, I don't know if I like him or not. I can admit that he's good, but he does this sort of tacit self-flagellation that I really don't like. There's a part in Disgrace, which is his most famous novel, and it won one of the prizes. I forget which. Hold on. Booker Prize, right, in 1999. And in that novel, the protagonist, I trust, who cares about spoilers? The protagonist's daughter gets raped, and for some reason, he's actually questioning whether he ought to feel like rage at the person who did it, just because he's a white South African and the guy who did it was a black South African. Like, why would you? Oh. And that attitude just annoys me immensely, because it's like, okay, we get it, Coetzee, you're removed from events and you're a writer and you're taking things carefully or whatever, but like, don't make this guy so much of a fool that he would actually feel anything other than just rage. Because trust me, he wouldn't. That annoyed me to no end. If you read a bit of Gormenghast and you liked it, you might consider moving further on into Mervyn Peake's work. And I didn't want to make a full video about this because compared to, I mean, as well as Gormenghast, he only wrote a couple of things. So it's not really worth making a full thing about. And they're very short things too. What are they? Mr. Pie, which is a novel that I have thought of before as an extension of Kazantzakis' Christ Re-Crucified. I'll explain that, right? So in Christ Re-Crucified, there's a bit where Manolis, the main character, kind of grows this sort of shell over his skin, and he looks really ugly and demonic and horrible, and it's a test from Christ, right? Because he retreats into the mountains and sort of becomes monk-like while everyone is sort of begging for him to come back down. And the longer he stays up there, the worse his face, the more demonic he becomes, until eventually the facade cracks off and, the pure-hearted holy Manolis is seen underneath once again. And it's kind of a reflection of what's going on in his heart. The more he tries to resist it, the worse his face becomes, as if to tempt him to say, come back to secularity, otherwise this is just going to get worse, but he bears it. And the central kind of theme of Mr. Pie is that there's this guy, appropriately named Mr. Pie, who he moves to the island of Sark and starts doing good deeds for people, and he grows a pair of wings, angel wings, that make it very, very difficult for him to do anything at all. And so he says, all right, I need to get rid of the wings, because this is not helping people think I'm an abomination. I need to do something. So he starts acting in an evil manner, and he grows a pair of devil's horns. So there's no escape for him. The more happens, and there's a happy ending to it, but that's sort of the conceit. And Mr. Pie is kind of what would happen if you just looked at that one bit of Christ Re-Crucified with Manolis and the devil face, and you extrapolated that into its own novel. And so that's one other thing by Mervyn Peake. And the other one is Boy in Darkness and Other Stories, which is quite rare, quite expensive, and not really fantastic. But if you really like Peake, I suppose it's worth the time. I suppose I could talk more by just sort of looking around this room and picking up books at random, but I kind of think this has gone on long enough, don't you? Still, it wasn't that bad, was it?